Welcome to the dark world of scary stories. A place where every sound is a premonition of the unknown, and every shadow is a step into another dimension. If you're ready to open the door to the scariest secrets, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the bell, because the scariest is yet to come. Turn on the light and let's begin. Pet Cemetery. Where the forest darkens, there stands an old cemetery. At first glance, it looks no different from an ordinary resting place. Cherry trees covered in moss, a few old marble tombstones that have rotted with time. But this cemetery is not for people. It is a cemetery for pets. Its history goes back several decades, when an unknown man, looking like an old man abandoned by his family, decided to build a small refuge for his deceased four-legged friends. Someone saw him that day. With a mad look, he constantly shouted into the ruthless darkness, as if addressing invisible entities that, in his belief, lived in the earth. People from the neighboring village were too afraid to approach. They said that nothing good would come of it. And indeed, strange things began to happen soon after. At night, when the village was asleep, strange sounds were heard: howling, knocking, and the faint rustling of the earth. People who tried to approach the cemetery never returned home. As predicted, children began to tell terrifying stories about how the animals buried there came back to life. Stories that no one believed. But it was here, at this cemetery, that another reality began. A reality where the dead were only those who did not believe in the power of the darkness. David, who had moved to the village, had no idea about the cemetery when he first heard from the local elders how they heard the soft sound of paws walking along the muddy paths leading to the old graves. David was a skeptic. Like most people of his age, he didn't believe in the supernatural. He took all these stories as jokes, fabrications, or just the insane fantasies of villagers who had nothing better to do. But everything changed that night when he decided to take a walk and face his fears. And so, he stood in the dark forest, where almost nothing was visible. Only the moon illuminated the ground from outside, and his footsteps were the only sound. A strange feeling of anxiety gripped his soul. Suddenly, he stumbled upon an old fence. Walking along it, he saw the pet cemetery. Then, everything became clear. When he looked at the old moss-covered tombstones, his heart froze with horror. The sky reflected in his eyes, but there wasn't a single star. Instead, there were shadows moving. Something invisible and terrifying hid among those graves. David decided to leave the place and go back home, but suddenly he heard footsteps behind him. Light, yet noticeable. He turned around. There was no one. Only the wind whispered its ancient secrets. And then, out of nowhere, came the smell. The smell of damp fur that made his skin break out in cold sweat. He looked into the darkness and saw a pair of glowing eyes in the distance. The creature standing before him was terrifying, but not like any ordinary animal. Its fur was ruined, and its appearance, it seemed like it came from another world. With each step, this creature approached, and all David could do was run. Run without stopping, without looking back. But what he didn't know was that this wasn't just one animal. It was an army of stars and shadows that had awakened from what was buried beneath the earth. They could not be seen, but they were following. From that moment on, David never appeared in the village again. His disappearance became another confirmation of the terrifying legends circulating among the villagers. The cemetery remained a place of horror for them. But what hid in the darkness was only the beginning of a greater story. With the dawn, when the sky was painted in cold shades of purple, the villagers could not recover from the horror for a long time. After David's disappearance, fear gripped everyone who lived near that same cemetery. Some tried to convince themselves that it was just a coincidence, while others whispered quietly that the dead were returning that night. But among them was one who knew more than the rest. Henry, the old farmer who had lived in the village his entire life, often talked about his past, though no one could understand what he truly meant. Henry was one of those who remembered how it all began. Many years ago, when the village was still not so closed off and suspicious, he had visited the cemetery with others, not giving it much thought. Back then, it was simply a place where pets who had died from old age or illness were buried. But one day, he came across a man who began to bury his animals there and quietly whispered that they would return. Henry had never believed those rumors until something happened that changed everything. Some chickens had disappeared from his farm, and in the morning, he found only torn feathers and paw prints leading to the cemetery. That's when he understood. where there is darkness and death, another, incomprehensible life grows. One evening, a few days after David's disappearance, Henry set off for the cemetery. He moved quietly, making no unnecessary gestures, trying to follow the paths known only to the elderly, so as not to fall into a trap. However, he was ready for anything. He had heard stories about how no one ever returned from that place, but he was determined to uncover the truth. He was not afraid. When he arrived at the cemetery, Henry recognized the familiar tombstones, but nothing seemed as he remembered it. Everything looked different. The gravestones in the front row seemed to move in the shadows, but it was just an illusion. His heart raced when he heard the faint but persistent rustle of paws. Something was nearby, and then among the trees he saw them. The dead animals returning to life, not as ordinary zombies, but as something dark and devious. Their eyes glowed red, their fur hung loose and spoiled, and their bodies seemed to change, as if they were merely shells for something else. Henry tried not to move, for he knew that any sound, any action, would only attract their attention. But he couldn't avoid it. One of them lifted its head and looked at him. The animal that had once been a kind dog was now only a shadow of what it had once been. Suddenly, one of these creatures, a large black dog, leaped from its spot and charged straight at him. Henry felt the cold breath of death emanating from its gaze, from the fiery gleam in its eyes. He ran, not looking back. The animals, as if in competition, raced to catch up with him. But he couldn't outrun them. They were trained by the shadow. They moved as one, not stopping. And they knew Henry would not escape. But he was lucky. At the last moment, he found a hiding place between two large trees, where he watched the dark figure drawing closer. Henry clenched his teeth, trying not to reveal himself. And that was the worst part. He realized that this terror would not end. The cemetery for pets had entered a new era, and with every step, he would never be alone. It would become part of their world. These creatures would not disappear. They would multiply. The next morning, when Henry left that place, he said nothing. He returned home, and in his eyes, there was not only fear but also understanding. The dead do not die in the cemetery. They wait. They wait for the darkness that allows them to return. And as long as someone doubts, as long as no one believes, the cemetery will keep growing. But not all of them return. Henry never appeared in the village again, though his grave remained as unnoticed as he had been. All that was left in place of him was the heavy memory in the hearts of those who remembered his last words. Don't go there. Don't enter their world. They do not wait for mercy. But time and fear have their own power. Gradually, people began to forget the warning. Some of them ventured back to the cemetery, succumbing to curiosity or trying to prove that all these stories were just fabrications. But anyone who went there at night never returned. And in their place, new shadows remained, new eyes glowing in the darkness. One day, on another cold autumn evening when the moon was half bent and the wind pierced to the bone, a family from the big city arrived in the village. A mother, father, and 2 children. They had come for the weekend to enjoy the fresh air and the tranquility of the village. The children, as is often the case, were captivated by the stories told by the older villagers. Full of their unshakable belief in their own bravery, the children persuaded their parents to visit the cemetery for pets. Their path was the same as before, fog and calm. Only when they neared the place where the black, moss-covered tombstone stood, something changed. The children started spinning in place, feeling an odd, almost physical tension in the air. In their eyes, it was not just curiosity but a sensation that comes only when you are on the edge of something that cannot be understood. There's nothing scary here, the father tried to reassure them. But the further they went, the stronger they felt that something was wrong. The children suddenly froze, as if they had fainted, staring at the ground. Their eyes widened even more, and their lips barely whispered. There, under the ground, they are returning. That evening, what everyone had feared happened. The mother and father couldn't even understand what had occurred. They were near the cemetery, and the children were exhausted, their gazes hollow, as if they no longer belonged to them. They no longer spoke. They didn't look at their parents, they just stood there, like the dead. And in the darkness, where no sound could be heard, the scent of damp fur appeared. The animals, the creatures that had once lived among people, were no longer animals. They were beings from another world. They circled around, like something out of a fairy tale, and created a mist that consumed everything in its path. The children, who had been laughing just hours ago, suddenly burst into tears the moment the mother and father saw dark figures slowly moving among the trees. It was an army of those same animals, who seemed to never die. Their paws left marks in the earth, and every movement they made was filled with a sense of cold, ruthless power. "We have to leave," the mother whispered, trying to take the children. But there was no way back. No matter how fast they ran, these creatures were everywhere. They brought death with them. And that fear did not go away. It was not just a physical presence, but an invisible shadow that pierced every cell of the body. No one knows how it happened. But that evening, when the family returned home without their children, they brought nothing but broken souls and emptiness. And that night, in the very same cemeteries where generations of animals had been buried, new graves began to appear. Since then, the village remained empty. The sight of the cemetery no longer brought peace. It brought only fear. Fear of what lay beneath the earth and what would never be forgotten. The pet cemetery remained a place where a new shadow grew, and this world was no longer what we had once known it to be. Everyone who approached this place knew that not even the sun could drive away the shadows that should never have left this place. With each passing year, as autumn brought cold and darkness, those who remained in the village felt more and more how the frightening place, the cemetery, began to grow. Not only in the real world but also in their nightmares. And although most avoided those roads and woods, there occurred one extraordinary event that became the last straw for them. One day, a traveler came to the village. A young man, an adventurer. His name was Thomas. He had heard of the mysterious disappearances that had happened in this village, and he was eager to find out what was really going on. His heart raced with impatience, and his mind was captivated by the mystery of what had occurred here. He was sure he would find a rational explanation for everything. And so, driven by a desire to uncover the truth, he set off to the very heart of this terrifying place. Thomas had never heard of the old Henry, and so he was unaware of the terrifying warnings left for those who dared to witness the true nature of the cemetery. Like all those before him, he walked, initially with slight doubt, but sinking deeper into his thoughts. The forest seemed quiet as he walked through it, and though he could hear his heart beating fast behind him, he did not stop. It seemed that even the trees grew calm as he approached the place. It was as if they knew something. This forest was ancient, and it absorbed all the secrets, all the terrors of the world. It could be seen even in the reports left by other brave souls before their disappearance. Thomas reached the spot where the forest opened and seemed completely different, dead. The cemetery was shrouded in cold fog, which only heightened his fear. Everything looked as if nothing had changed for decades. As soon as he stepped onto the ground, all the sounds of the world, from his footsteps to the faint breath of the wind, were silenced. And it was then that he heard it. That sound. The soft rustling of paws. At first, it might have been the wind. But Thomas already felt that it was not just a natural response. Strangely calmly, as though it was the most normal thing, shadows began to slowly appear among the tombstones. They moved silently, and Thomas saw their eyes begin to glow. These were not animals. These were creatures. Deadly, but full of strength and intelligence. They approached, and though fear tried to take hold of him, Thomas had no time for doubts. He tried to flee, but each step felt heavy, as if the earth itself was trying to stop him. If it weren't for the hissing winds in the darkness, he might not have felt that these creatures were not just chasing him. They were already here. They stopped, and around him, silence fell. And then Thomas saw it, a huge, black figure standing before him. This was not just a creature. It was something more, something that surpassed everything he could have imagined. Its enormous eyes, glowing red, watched him, as if deciding what to do next. "You do not belong here," the figure whispered, and although it did not move, Thomas felt its words penetrate deeply into his soul. "You should not have known." And then, as he tried to make his final move, two more figures appeared before him. They were not like ordinary animals. Their forms shifted fluidly, as though they were rewriting themselves from one existence to another. And then he understood, they weren't just coming back to life. They were part of something old and invisible, and this cemetery was only a part of a great trap that ensnared anyone who asked too many questions. From the moment his body fell to the ground, Thomas became another part of this place. His soul joined the shadow that walked among the tombstones. And just like the others, He would never leave this place. His eyes now glowed with the same red light seen by all those before him. All those who dared to learn what hid in the shadows of the pet cemetery. No one heard from Thomas again. But others who made their way to this place would soon learn that there is no return. Only shadows remain around the cemetery, waiting for those who could not escape their power. The cemetery fills again, and no one can say what truly happens beneath the earth. And although the village was no longer deserted, the inhabitants gradually grew accustomed to a new reality, where their nightmares were no longer just dreams. Only the oldest and most experienced people, who still remembered the stories of the old night and the unknown shadows, knew that the cemetery was not just a burial place. It was a kind of window to something else, drawing creatures from the depths of darkness, beings that could not be described by words. The villagers no longer walked at night, and for those who still dared approach the cemetery, there was only one thing left to do: walk and not look back. However, over time, even these places began to fade from the memories of those who lived there, and it became clear that it was not just fear. It was not just an experience or a mystery. It was a predestined future, one that could not be escaped. And one night, when the darkness struck the earth like never before, a young woman named Eliza decided to come to the village. She was a researcher of ancient customs and legends, particularly those concerning ghosts, demons, and forgotten rituals. Eliza had learned about the pet cemetery and, hearing numerous stories of disappearances, she decided that it would become her next subject of research. She believed she would find answers to all the questions that no local had been able to answer. No one warned her of the danger. Everyone silently watched as she walked toward that place, and not a single face showed doubt. She was already too late. That night, there was neither moon nor stars. The air smelled of damp earth, and the fog lay like a heavy blanket on the ground. Every step Eliza took felt heavy, but she did not stop. She was determined. Her free spirit did not recognize limits, and she stubbornly marched toward what few dared even mention. That terrifying echo in her heart shattered with the same old stories she had heard from the people. But she was ready for it. She thought it would only be an illusion. She thought it was just fiction. Everything before her was only fog. And even more so when, somewhere in the center of the cemetery, she heard something rustling in the darkness. She could not believe that it could be real. But then, in the foggy light, she saw them. The same black figures, dark shapes moving with incredible speed, like ghosts rising from the earth. Their red eyes glowed in the darkness, and every movement was precise, as if calculated and planned. Eliza froze, and cold ran through her body. She tried not to move, not to attract attention. But it was already too late. One of them, a large dog, lifted its head and stared directly into her eyes. And although she tried to convince herself that it was just an illusion, her heart raced as if she were on the edge of death. Meanwhile, the shadows began to wrap around her, to consume her. She tried to scream, but her voice died in her throat. And when she thought all was lost, one of the dark creatures approached her and whispered, as if from another world, "You learned the truth too late." In that instant, cold enveloped her body. Everything turned dark, and Eliza could no longer feel anything except the heavy, muffled fog that surrounded her. What happened to her was unknown to both those who remained in the village and those who still came to that place where the most terrifying events took place. Her name was no longer mentioned, and the cemetery became an even more terrifying, darker place. And though more and more people tried to forget this place, deep in the hearts of each, there remained fear. Fear that even after death, these creatures would wait for those who dared mock them and seek answers that would never be given. All who came and remained became part of the shadows that stretch across the land, forever living in that place that no longer belonged to the world of the living. And although many years had passed since that time, and the village had become a shadow of itself, there was one thing no one could forget: the echo of fear that never left their hearts, even in the calmest moments. People who decided to leave the place increasingly felt that they could never escape what had happened in the shadow of the pet cemetery. One winter evening, a new group of researchers arrived in the village. They were young students, ambitious and full of energy, afraid of nothing. They had heard the terrifying stories, but they treated them as old legends. They didn't believe they would encounter anything that truly existed. "It's just a hoax," said one of them, Laura. "If it's real, we'll prove it's nothing more than old tales." They all laughed at what they had heard, even jokingly threatening one of their own, Daniel, that they would check everything they could and leave the place without a doubt about its safety. They understood that their fear was only born from the unknown, and they decided to go to the place where this dark story had begun. Packing their things, they set off to the place that, even in the daylight, looked abandoned and gloomy. With every step closer to the cemetery, they felt the darkness growing heavier, the air colder. Like the travelers before them, they didn't know what awaited them. They were all young, ready for any challenge, and didn't believe the old legends could hold any truth. Yet, as soon as they stepped onto the cemetery grounds, they all felt as if each step made the air thicker and the shadows larger. Laura was the first to notice how one of the stone gravestones shuddered for a moment, then became still again, just like all the others. She said nothing, trying not to show her fear. But the feeling that something was happening to them was so strong that even the most skeptical among them began to feel uneasy. And then, as they began their investigation among the graves, each of them sensed a strange movement, seemingly without source. At first, there was silence, then a slow ticking, impossible to explain. They started checking the graves, and suddenly one of their cameras caught a sound, like whispering, coming from the dark depths. Everyone froze. "What's that?" Laura whispered. And then, something happened that none of them expected. From the darkness, as if rising from beneath the earth, shadows began to slowly rise. At first, they were faint outlines, indistinct and almost transparent, but with each passing moment, they became clearer, more detailed. Laura saw the first. It was a huge dog, turning its red eyes toward them, as if sensing their fear. And then, the dog lunged forward, and others appeared, their movements growing faster and more aggressive. The shadows, once calm, now had the form of distinct, terrifying creatures. They moved among the graves like predators, ready to pounce on their prey. The students began to panic, trying to run, but each step felt as if it were dragging them down. The darkness thickened, and the sound spread around them like an endless echo of some incomprehensible force. Everyone who fought the panic and tried to escape quickly realized, here, in this place, there was no escaping. "We have to go," shouted one of the students, but her words were meaningless. They were already surrounded. Their feet felt the silent pressure, and they all sensed something heavy pulling them back with every movement. Laura ran ahead, but a heavy, cold feeling fell over her heart. And then, she saw another figure, massive and black, rising directly from the darkness. It was a creature beyond description. It was neither an animal nor a human. In its eyes reflected endless darkness and pain. It was like everything and nothing at once. Laura understood that this was the end, and she could no longer breathe. Since then, no one saw them again. The shadows consumed them, and what happened at the cemetery remained dark and inexpressible. The students never returned to their towns, and their names gradually faded from the memory of those who remained. The legends continued to live on, and the cemetery remained a place where no one was allowed to leave a trace. The shadows were always there, waiting for the next brave soul to come and explore this world that does not belong to us. And so, as darkness once again envelopes you, we say goodbye, but not for long. Remember, the night is never truly safe. Subscribe so you don't miss the new horrors, and come back when it's time for new nightmares. Beware of the shadows, they are always near. Until next time.